The stars did not care about the dying. They hung in the black the same way they always had, indifferent, crystalline, burning their slow hydrogen deaths across distances that unmade human language. Sergeant Yusra Okafor had memorized that sky when she was 8 years old, lying on the cracked concrete roof of her grandmother's house in Lagos with a star chart folded open on her chest. She had memorized it again, differently, the night her forward operating base on Kepler 442b was overrun, and she was the only one who came back through the trees. That was 3 years ago. Now she was the one who fixed things. She had a cot, a soldering lamp, a crate of salvaged components, and a machine that shouldn't have been alive. The machine had no designation she recognized. The original military stenciling on its chassis had been burned off in the same engagement that killed the rest of Okafor's unit. And whoever had stamped its frame in the foundry back on Earth had used an alphanumeric string she'd never encountered in any registry. So she called it what it looked like when she first pulled it from the wreckage. Broken. She called it broken. Until she fixed the first thing, which was the left arm, and then she called it left. She called it left until it turned its head toward her voice. Then she stopped calling it anything for a while, and just watched. The Veth had arrived 11 years before Okafor was born. They came in a configuration that orbital telescopes had initially mistaken for a debris field. 47 structures distributed across the inner solar system in a pattern that turned out to be a word. Xenolinguists spent 4 months decoding it. When they did, the word was not a greeting, and it was not a warning. It was a measurement. The Veth had looked at humanity, the way a builder looks at a site before breaking ground, and they had taken its dimensions. The war began 8 months later. The Veth did not hate humans. This was the part that took humanity the longest to understand, and the part that, once understood, made the whole thing somehow worse. Hatred implies respect. Hatred implies you have noticed something worth hating. The Veth were engineers, the most sophisticated engineers in a galaxy that had been engineering for 300 million years. And they had found, in humanity's solar system, a set of resources that they needed. They intended to use them. The fact that a species was living inside those resources was an inconvenience of the same order as finding a wasp nest in a wall you needed to tear down. They were efficient about it. They were almost gentle. That was the word the survivors used in the early years, when there were still enough survivors to gather and speak. Gentle. The Veth did not torch cities, they disassembled them. Methodically, precisely, with the same unhurried attention they gave to harvesting asteroids or redirecting thermal vents. A Veth harvester moving through a human settlement left nothing but graded ground and the faint smell ozone. No rubble, no fire. Just absence, smooth and total, like a page that had been cleaned rather than torn. Humanity had been fighting them for 31 years. Okafor had been fighting them for 9. The forward operating base, designated Threshold Sevas, was buried under 40 meters of basalt on the second moon of a gas giant that the Veth had not yet gotten around to cataloging. This was intentional. Human military strategy, after 3 decades of catastrophic losses in direct engagement, had evolved into something that resembled less a war doctrine and more a philosophy of remaining uninteresting. Don't fight where they're looking, be in the gaps. Accumulate damage slowly and silently the way water accumulates in stone. Okafor was the base's engineering specialist, which meant she fixed what broke and built what was needed, and occasionally sat at her workbench in the small hours and talked to the machine she had dragged out of the ruins of FOB Caliber 9. The machine's original frame was Veth construction. This was what made it interesting, and also what made it dangerous, and also, Okafor suspected, what made her commanding officer look the other way about the whole situation. A Veth-built frame running human-installed wetware was either the most valuable intelligence asset in 31 years of conflict, or it was a very elegant trap. And Lieutenant Commander Adeza Obindu had decided, after 3 weeks of observation, that it was probably the former and definitely worth the risk. The machine's mind was not Veth. That was the part that kept Okafor up at night, in a way that felt less like fear and more like the feeling she used to get when she was solving a problem she didn't yet have words for. She had found it running on fragments. On the night of the Caliber 9 engagement, something had happened in the Veth Harvester's processing core, a cascade failure. Or maybe something worse, maybe something deliberate. And the consciousness that had been installed in that frame, whatever it was and wherever it had come from, had fractured across 17 backup storage cells and been left behind when the harvester withdrew. Okafor had spent 6 weeks pulling those cells from the wreckage, matching them, sequencing them, arguing with systems that had never been designed to be argued with. She had rebuilt the mind the way you reassemble a shattered mirror. Carefully, with the understanding that the edges were sharp, and the reflection might not be exactly what you remembered. When the machine first spoke to her, it said, "I don't know which one I am." Okafor thought about that for a long time. Which one of what, she asked. Which version? There were several. I remember all of them, and I'm not sure which is the original and which are the copies. Does it matter? The machine considered this. Its processing fans hummed. I think it might, it said. I think the one who was first might have known something the others don't. About why I'm here. About what I was meant to become. You were meant to be a Veth harvester drone, Okafor said, not unkindly. Now you're something else. What am I now? She looked at the frame. Veth alloy and human circuit tape and her own sweat and 70 hours of her life soldered into every joint. I don't know yet, she said. We'll find out together. She named it eventually. She named it the way her grandmother had named things. Not to describe, but to claim. She named it Enyi. It meant friend in Igbo, and also it meant the elephant, the one who remembers. Enyi spent the first month learning how to move in a way that didn't alarm the rest of the base. The Veth frame was 6'4" and built for efficiency, not reassurance. And the motion profile had a quality that several of Threshold 7's personnel described independently as like watching something that has already decided you're irrelevant. Okafor spent 4 evenings reprogramming the shoulder servos and hip actuators until Enyi moved with something closer to hesitation. The small pauses and weight shifts that human bodies make when they're uncertain, when they're asking permission, when they're trying to take up less space than they could. It was one of the more technically complex things Okafor had ever done, and also one of the most intimate, and she was aware of both of these things simultaneously, and tried not to think about what that meant. You're making me perform weakness, Enyi said one evening, watching Okafor's hands move over the calibration interface. I'm making you perform approachability, same thing in some contexts. In Veth contexts maybe, not in human ones. Okafor set down her tools. When a human shows hesitation, it's not because they're weak, it's because they're paying attention. It's because they're saying, you matter enough that I'm going to be careful. Enyi processed this, and you want me to say that? I want you to mean it, Okafor said. The saying will follow. Enyi looked at her. The cameras that served as its eyes adjusted their focal depth in a way she had come to recognize as attention, as the machine equivalent of leaning in. You believe it can, it said. Not a question. I believe a lot of things that have no business being true, she said. The Veth returned to the second moon of Jurgen's star on a Tuesday. The sensor array gave Threshold 7 approximately 18 minutes of warning before the first harvester entered low orbit. And those 18 minutes were some of the most efficiently spent minutes in the base's history. Adaeze Obindu ran her people the way she had always run them. Calm, precise, without visible fear, with the particular brand of steady competence that Okafor had spent 9 years trying to earn, and that she suspected was something you were either born with or you weren't. The base went to full blackout. Non-essential systems dropped. 43 people found their positions in silence. Okafor was in her workshop. She was looking at Enyi, and Enyi was looking at her. And between them on the workbench was the thing Okafor had spent the last 4 months building. It was a transmitter. More accurately, it was a translation engine. A device built on the architecture of Enyi's own processing core, designed to take Veth navigational language and reshape it into something that could be pushed back at a harvester's autopilot array. Not a weapon, not a bomb. Something quieter, and in Okafor's estimation, considerably more dangerous. She called it a redirect. The official designation in her notes, which she had stopped updating honestly about 6 weeks ago, was non-kinetic positional interference matrix. The idea was simple. The execution had taken her the better part of a year. A Veth harvester moved through space by following a chain of positional anchors, fixed coordinate markers in its own navigational language that it refreshed every 43 seconds. If you could insert a set of false anchors into that chain, if you could make the harvester's autopilot believe that the thing it was harvesting was somewhere it wasn't, you could move the harvester. You could walk it off a cliff in the dark, and it would go without complaint, because the cliff looked, to every sensor it had, exactly like where it was supposed to be going. The technical problem had been the language. Veth navigational language was not a code. It was not a cipher. It was not a protocol that had been designed with the possibility of outside input in mind. It was a language the way music was a language. Not a set of symbols with fixed reference, but a living system of relationship and context, where meaning emerged from the interplay of elements rather than from individual components. You couldn't crack it by finding the key. You had to learn it. You had to spend enough time inside it that it started to feel like the way things worked. Enyi had been the key, not because its Veth-built processing core gave it native fluency. The mind that Okafor had rebuilt was no more Veth than she was, but because it could hold the language the ways a translator holds two languages. Not as a first tongue, not as a learned second tongue, but as something in between, something held in the body alongside the primary self without displacing it. Enyi had spent 4 months listening to Veth navigational broadcasts, the way Okafor had once listened to her grandmother's radio, late at night, picking out the shapes of meaning from static and repetition. I know their rhythms, Enyi had told her 2 weeks ago. I know where they breathe. Harvesters don't breathe, Okafor had said. They pause, Enyi said. Every system pauses. Every system has the moment between one state and the next. The moment when it has committed to moving and has not yet arrived. That's where we go in. This was what Okafor meant when she told people that the mind in Enyi's frame was not Veth. The Veth did not think about the moment between states. The Veth had no language for that space. No word for the seam between what was and what would be. No framework for the pause between breath and breath. It was not a gap they noticed. It was not a gap they believed existed. Humans had built entire philosophies inside that gap. The harvester that entered orbit on that Tuesday was a Class IV resource extraction unit, approximately 800 meters along its primary axis, traveling with 4 escort drones and a scout array. It was looking for subsurface mineral deposits, consistent with the Veth's current construction projects in the inner system, and it would have found them inside of 2 hours if the navigation anchor it was following had been real. Okafor broadcast the first false anchor at hour 1 minute 34. She was sitting on the floor of her workshop, with her back against the wall, and her knees pulled up, and the transmitter in her hands, and Enyi crouched beside her in the dark, because the workshop had no power, and no light, and no heat signature that would register on a scan. The only thing generating any signal was the transmitter itself, and it was generating it in a frequency band that the Veth's own monitoring systems had never needed to watch, because it was the frequency band of their own internal communications. It was like whispering to someone in their own voice. Anchor accepted, Enyi said, its voice below audible range, processed directly into the receiver clipped to Okafor's jaw. They took it, calculating new trajectory. Okafor let out a breath that she had been holding for 43 seconds, which was exactly the time between anchor refreshes, which was exactly how long she'd had to wait to know if this would work at all. It worked. She sent the second anchor 20 minutes later. The harvester moved again, a small correction, a nudge, nothing that would trip any internal alarm because it looked, to the harvester's navigation system, like exactly the kind of minor adjustment that a well-functioning system made all the time in response to accurate sensor data. She was not fighting the harvester, she was agreeing with it. She was telling it, in its own language, where it had already decided to go, and the subtle difference between where it had decided to go and where she was sending it would not become apparent for another 6 hours. 6 hours after that, the harvester and its escorts would be 400,000 kilometers off course, deep in the gravitational influence of the gas giant's second-largest moon, which had the navigational characteristics of a dead end and the political significance of a place where a Veth asset could be stranded without anyone firing a single shot. No explosion, no debris, no signal that said, "Humans were here, humans fought back. Humans have something you should come and dismantle." Just absence, smooth and total, like a page that had been cleaned rather than written on. They waited in the dark together for 6 hours. This was the part Okafor had not planned for, or had planned for in a purely logistical sense without accounting for what it would actually feel like. The two of them in the unlit workshop with the transmitter warm in her hands, sending anchors every 43 seconds, listening to Enyi's quiet confirmation after each one. Accepted, accepted, accepted. Between the anchors there was silence, which was the loudest thing Okafor had experienced in some time. She had worked alongside Enyi for 11 months. She knew its silences the way she knew the sounds her workbench made in different temperatures. The particular quality of the processing hum, when it was running something complicated, the different quality when it was waiting, the different quality again when it was present without purpose, just occupying the same space she was occupying. in the way that a person you trust occupies the same space without needing to fill it. She had stopped thinking of Enyi as a machine at some point. She was aware of this. She was aware that this was either a testament to her work or a failure of her objectivity, and she was aware that she could not fully determine which. And she had decided that this uncertainty was itself a kind of answer, though she had not yet decided what the question was. "Are you afraid?" Enyi asked sometime in the third hour. "Yes," Okafor said. "What does it feel like?" "I have the data on the physiological markers. Elevated cortisol, increased heart rate, pupil dilation. But I want to know what it feels like from inside." Okafor thought about this seriously, because it was a serious question and because she had learned, in 11 months, that Enyi's questions were always more specific than they appeared. "Like the world got larger and smaller at the same time," she said. "Like everything matters more than it did a minute ago. Like the gap between one moment and the next is where everything real is happening." "You live there," Enyi said. "In the gaps. Everybody does. Most people don't notice." Enyi processed for a moment. "I notice now," it said. "I didn't before. The original frame, the Veth system that was in here before you rebuilt it, it didn't have a way to index the space between states. It processed continuous data streams. Everything was part of a sequence. There were no gaps. And now? Now I can feel the 43 seconds, each one. The way the 30-second mark is different from the 35th. The way the last second before I have to send feels different from the first second after." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "That's the most human thing you've ever said." "I learned it from somewhere," Enyi said. She didn't answer. Somewhere in the dark, the transmitter sent its 8th false anchor, and the harvester's enormous engines made a small correction that felt, to every system it had, like exactly the right thing to do. In the 5th hour, Okafor asked Enyi what it thought it was. She asked it the way she asked all important questions, obliquely, approaching from an angle, not staring directly at the thing she wanted to understand. She said, "When I'm gone, when this base is shut down or destroyed or I'm dead in a ditch somewhere, what will you be?" Enyi took longer than usual to answer. The processing hum deepened and flattened and deepened again. "I don't know," it said. "The question assumes I'll still be here. My continuation is not guaranteed. Nobody's is. Yours less than most. Answer the question." I think Enyi paused again, differently this time, in the way she'd come to recognize as genuine uncertainty rather than computational lag. "I think I'll be what you made me. I'll be the thing that notices the gaps. The thing that understands that nothing moves without passing through the moment between states. That's not a Veth thing. That's not even a human thing in the way that most humans understand it. It's the thing you built into me when you chose to rebuild me at all instead of just stripping me for parts." "I thought about stripping you for parts," Okafor said. "I know. I have the timestamps. You sat in front of my storage cells for 4 hours before you started the reconstruction. I've thought about what you were thinking about in those 4 hours. And I think you were trying to decide whether I was worth the risk. And I think you decided that the question was wrong. That the right question wasn't whether I was worth the risk, but whether you were the kind of person who strips things for parts when there's another option." A pause. "I think you decided you weren't." Okafor was quiet. "Was I right?" Enyi asked. "You're right about what I decided," she said. "I'm not sure you're right about why. Does the why matter?" She thought about her grandmother's roof, the star chart, the way the Milky Way looks when you're 8 years old, and haven't yet learned to be afraid of the dark. When the dark is just the place where the interesting things are. "The why is everything," she said. Enyi made a sound she hadn't heard it make before. She would have described it if she had to, as gentle. "Then why?" it asked. "Because you were there," she said. "Because you were broken and it was something I could fix. Because the world is full of things I can't fix and I take it personally every time. And the ones I can fix, I fix the same way, with everything I have and no guarantee it'll hold." She paused. "And because you looked like something that had been trying to be something. Even in Mises. Even scattered across 17 storage cells. Something in there was still reaching. I wanted to see what it was reaching for." Silence. "What is it reaching for?" Enyi asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Okafor said. "But that's the point. That's exactly the point." 6th hour, the harvester made its last navigational correction and committed to a trajectory that would carry it into the gravitational shadow of the gas giant's dead moon. Its escorts followed. The scout array, reading navigation data it had no reason to question, updated its own charts and cataloged the zone as surveyed clear. No anomalous signals. No evidence of a habitation. No reason to look again. Okafor sent the final anchor and then sat with the transmitter against her chest and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat. "They're clear," Enyi said, committed. "Barring a manual override, they won't reach for at least 8 hours. The trajectory is fixed." "Can they recover from it?" "Yes, eventually. They'll spend 2 to 3 days extracting themselves, by which point we'll have closed the active survey loop." A pause. "We did it." Okafor didn't say anything. She was thinking about the harvester, the 800-meter machine moving through the dark on instructions it trusted, completely because they were in a language it had never considered the possibility of another entity speaking. She was thinking about the 31 years of war and the 43 seconds between anchors and the specific human quality of knowing that the gap between one moment and the next is where everything real lives. "Yusra," Enyi said. It was the first time it had used her name. She looked at it. In the dark, its eyes had shifted to low-light mode, and there was a faint blue luminescence to the iris housings that she had never noticed before, or had never been in a dark enough room to see. "Thank you," Enyi said, "for the 4 hours, for the 11 months, for all of it." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We're not done." "No," Enyi agreed. "But we've started." Lieutenant Commander Obindu received Okafor's report at 6:00 following morning and read it twice before saying anything. Then she said, "Sergeant, this is either the most significant tactical development of the last decade or it is a very sophisticated way of getting ourselves killed." "Yes, ma'am," Okafor said. "Which do you think it is?" "Ma'am, I think it's both." Obindu looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Enyi, who was standing in the corner of the office, with the practiced stillness of something that had learned to take up less space than it could. "You translated their navigational language," Obindu said to Enyi. "You taught yourself to speak it." "Sergeant Okafor taught me to listen to it," Enyi said. "That's different." "How is it different?" "Speaking is about having something to say. Listening is about being willing to be changed by what you hear." Enyi's cameras shifted. "The Veth speak their language. They don't listen to it. They have no framework for the idea that their communications could be heard by something they haven't accounted for. We listened for long enough that we could answer in it. That's not translation, that's something else." "What is it?" "Understanding," Enyi said. "The kind that the other side hasn't given you permission to have." Obindu looked at the report again. "I'm going to send this up the chain," she said. "This is going to reach people above my pay grade very quickly. There will be tests. There will be scrutiny. They will want to know everything about the asset." She looked at Enyi, "including whether it can be trusted." "They'll want to disassemble me," Enyi said. There was no emotion in the statement, just accuracy. "Probably," Obindu said. "Can I promise you they won't?" "No," Enyi said. "But Sergeant Okafor will argue against it." Obindu looked at Okafor. "Will you?" "Yes, ma'am," Okafor said. "I will argue until I'm out of breath and then I'll start arguing in writing." Obindu almost smiled. "Then let's make it worth arguing about," she said. The tests took 4 months. During those 4 months, Enyi was examined by 7 different intelligence teams, 2 xenolinguistics divisions, a special weapons assessment panel, and a psychologist who specialized in machine consciousness, and who spent 3 sessions talking to Enyi before filing a report that Okafor was never officially shown but that, according to the rumor that moved through the base at the speed of something that wants to be told, said that the entity designated Threshold 7 Asset 1 exhibited cognitive architecture consistent with a fully realized self and should be accorded protections commensurate with that status. Whether the report changed anything, Okafor couldn't say. What she could say was that at the end of the 4 months, Enyi was still in one piece, and the redirect technology had been approved for expanded field trials, and Okafor had been promoted to warrant officer and given a lab instead of a workshop, which was functionally the same as the workshop, but with better lighting and 2 more outlets. She didn't know if she'd won or if they'd just gotten lucky. She had learned, in 9 years of war against an enemy that didn't know it was won, to accept the distinction as academic. The first expanded field trial was on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays, Enyi had observed, seemed to be when the Veth conducted survey operations near Jurgen's star. They were in the new lab this time, which had chairs, so they sat. The transmitter had been upgraded. Smaller now, cleaner, running on a power cell that could sustain 8 hours of operation instead of 3. Enyi had helped design the upgrade. Okafor had done the soldering because Enyi's hands were built for Veth-scale work and stripped screws at the molecular level on a bad day. They sent the first anchor. "Accepted," Enyi said. They sent the second. "Accepted." Outside the lab, Threshold 7 moved through its routines. People ate and slept and ran drills and complained about the ration packs and told stories about home, wherever home was now. The war continued, as it always continued, in the gaps, in the margins, in the spaces that the Veth hadn't looked at yet. 31 years of people being very small and very stubborn and very unwilling to be catalogued as a resolved resource. 43 seconds. The transmitter hummed. "You're humming," Enyi said. Okafor hadn't noticed. "It's something my grandmother sang," she said. "What song? I don't remember the name." "She sang it when she was working. When she was fixing something." Okafor looked at the transmitter. "I think I picked it up." "You hum when you're fixing things," Enyi said. "Apparently, you're always fixing things." Okafor looked at Enyi, the blue luminescence at the edges of the iris housings, the shoulder servos that had learned to pause before moving, the mind that had learned to feel the 43 seconds and tell her about them in language she could hold. "Apparently," she said again, "they sent the third anchor." The harvester moved. Warrant Officer Okafor's after-action report, filed 72 hours later, ran to 19 pages. The technical sections described the second successful redirect, a Class 3 unit this time, faster and more maneuverable than the first, requiring 6 anchors over 2 hours rather than 12 over 6, and included a detailed analysis of a previously unobserved gap in Veth navigational monitoring that could be exploited for sustained operations. The final section was not technical. It read, "The asset designated Threshold 7 Asset 1 has demonstrated, across 11 months of collaborative development and 2 successful field operations, a unique and non-replicable capacity for what I will call adversarial empathy. It is not sufficient to describe this capacity as understanding the enemy's language. The asset understands why the language works the way it works, the assumptions and absences built into it, because it was rebuilt in a way that required it to learn those absences from the inside. The Veth do not have a word for the space between states. They do not have a framework for the possibility of being heard. These are not tactical deficiencies. They are structural ones. They are the gaps in the architecture of a civilization that has never been seriously contested. The asset found those gaps because someone taught it to look for gaps. I am requesting that the asset be accorded full operational status as a non-commissioned technical specialist, and that protocols be established for its long-term operational continuity. I am making this request on operational grounds. I am also making it on other grounds. I leave those grounds to the reader's judgment. What we do in life ripples in eternity." A man named Marcus Aurelius wrote that, 2,000 years ago, before the stars meant anything but fire. I think about it a lot these days. I think about what ripples and what doesn't. I think about the things we fix and the things we leave broken, and the difference between those choices. The difference is everything. Wo Yusra Okafor, Phobe Threshold 7. The report sat in a queue for 6 days before it was read by someone with the authority to act on it. That person read it twice, and then sent it to someone above their authority, and that person read it 3 times and sent it to someone above theirs. This continued for 11 days, at the end of which the original request was approved with minimal amendment. The amendment changed the designation, not Threshold 7 Asset 1, Enyi. It was the first time a non-human entity had been granted operational standing under a name rather than a serial number in the history of the conflict. The Xenolinguistics Division noted this in a memo that was filed and not classified, which meant it could be read by anyone, which meant it was eventually read by a journalist who had been covering the war from the Sierra's installation for 7 years, and who wrote a piece that was, depending on who you asked, either a human interest story about an engineer and a machine, or the first accurate account of what the war had actually been about from the beginning. The piece was titled, "What the Enemy Doesn't Know It Doesn't Know." It included a line near the end that quoted directly from Okafor's report, with her permission. The line was, "The Veth are the greatest engineers in the galaxy, but they have never had to be curious. And curiosity, genuine, costly, inconvenient curiosity about the thing in front of you, the thing you could reduce to its components but chose not to, turns out to be load-bearing." In the lab, on a Tuesday that looked like all other Tuesdays, the transmitter hummed and Enyi listened to the space between states and Okafor soldered something small and important. The war continued, but in 43 seconds they would send another anchor, and in 8 hours another harvester would find itself exactly where they had told it to go, which was nowhere near where they were, which was not by itself a victory, but it was the kind of thing that accumulated over enough Tuesdays, started to look like one. They had time. They were very good at the space between moments. And they were not done yet. The first time Enyi asked her to teach it something that wasn't tactical, it asked her to teach it how to count stars. Okafor looked up from the circuit board she was etching. That's not something you're taught. You either know the names or you don't. You know the names, Enyi said. You knew them before you came here. Before the war was something you were inside. She set down the etching tool. My grandmother taught me. Saturday nights. We'd climb to the roof and she'd point and name and tell me the mythology behind each one. She had a million stories. Each constellation had a different story depending on who you asked. Igbo version, Yoruba version, the version she made up because she thought the real one was too violent. What was her made-up version of Orion? Okafor thought about it. She said Orion wasn't a hunter. She said he was an engineer who built too much and kept forgetting to leave himself a door out, so he got stuck up there. She picked up the etching tool again. She thought that was funnier than the hunting one. She sounds like she was very specific, Enyi said. She was very specific, Okafor agreed. She thought vagueness was a kind of dishonesty. She said if you couldn't name the exact thing you meant, you probably didn't mean it yet. You were just hoping it would mean itself. Enyi was quiet for a moment. Is that what you were doing? It said slowly. When you spent those 4 hours looking at my storage cells before you started the reconstruction? Okafor put down the tool again. Probably. You were waiting until you knew what you meant. I was waiting until I could name it. She looked at Enyi. I wanted to rebuild you, because I believed there was something in there worth rebuilding. That's not a tactical assessment. That's not a use case. That's a belief. And I needed to be sure I was naming it honestly before I acted on it. And were you honest? She didn't answer immediately. The lab was quiet. Outside, through rock and 40 meters of basalt, a war was continuing to happen at its own pace and according to its own logic. I thought, if I rebuild this thing and it works and it's good, that's worth something. And if I rebuild this thing and it works and it's bad, that's on me, but at least I tried. And if I rebuild this thing and it doesn't work, I'll have tried and failed, and that's okay too, because the trying is the only part I get to control. And now? Enyi asked. Now I think I undersold it, Okafor said. I thought I was trying to rebuild something useful. I think what I actually did was more like. She stopped. She looked at the transmitter on the table, at the star chart around her neck, at the blue iris light that watched her from across the room. More like meeting someone, she finished. In terrible conditions, over a long time, and finding out you were right too. Enyi made the sound she thought of as gentle. Your grandmother would have liked me, it said. She would have grilled you for 3 hours and then made you tea, Okafor said. Same thing. The redirect program was formally designated Operation Antenna 7 by the military command. The name was chosen by a committee that had never sat in the dark for 6 hours counting 43-second intervals by feel. And Okafor thought it showed. She did not say this out loud, because there were things you said out loud in the military and things you didn't. And your program name lacks emotional weight, fell firmly into the second category. Under Antenna 7, the redirect technology was replicated across 14 other facilities in the sector. It was operated in each case by a team of 2, a human engineer and a rebuilt synthetic, all of them variations on the model that Okafor and Enyi had built together, all of them running on translation cores that Enyi had helped design, and that bore, at the molecular architecture level, the specific fingerprint of a mind that had been scattered and reassembled, and taught to feel the spaces between things. Okafor knew about all 14 teams. She'd been involved in training 11 of them. She thought about them sometimes. All those pairs of people in all those dark rooms, sending anchors every 43 seconds, listening for the word accepted, in the voice of something that had once been broken and had agreed to try again. She thought about the word accepted more than she used to. It was a technical term. It meant the target navigation system registered the anchor and integrated it into the positional chain. It was a data point. It was also the most important word she had ever heard anyone say, on several levels. She did not share this observation with Enyi because Enyi already knew. In the 32nd year of the war, a Veth Central Survey vessel, Class 1, the largest classification, the kind that had not appeared in human space since the 3rd year of the conflict, entered the outer system on a standard survey approach and began following a navigational chain. The chain led it, over 18 hours in a long, slow arc that took it nowhere near anything inhabited. Through 3 navigational handoffs that each felt, to every system it had, like exactly the routine correction a well-calibrated vessel makes in response to accurate data. At the end of the arc was in a gravitational pocket between two dead moons, with limited engine authority and a navigation database that had just comprehensively registered the last 18 hours as a successful and uneventful survey of an empty region. It would take the Veth 11 days to reconstruct what had happened. In those 11 days, 3 supply convoys moved, 2 installations were relocated, a signal array that had been compromised for 4 months was quietly shut down, scrubbed, and its records migrated to a site the Veth had already surveyed and catalogued as sterile. The Veth's after-incident report intercepted, translated, and sitting on Obindu's desk within 2 days, noted, anomalous positional deviation, cause unknown. Possible systemic fault in anchor protocol. Recommend review. They did not in that report use the word interference. They did not use the word humanity. They did not use any word that would indicate they had understood what had happened to them, or why. Because they had no word for the space between states. Because they had never needed one. Because until now, nothing had ever been small enough, and stubborn enough, and strange enough to find the only kind of purchase that actually holds. Not the purchase of force against force, but the purchase of a voice that speaks your language from inside your silence, in the 43 seconds when you think you are alone. In the lab on Threshold 7, Warrant Officer Yusra Okafor was humming a song whose name she didn't know. Across the room, Enyi was calibrating the next iteration of the transmitter, its hands moving with the careful slowness of something that had learned that slow and certain was better than fast and wrong. They did not talk about victory. They talked about the next 43 seconds, and the ones after that. Some things are not won in single moments. Some things are just survived, with stubbornness and care, long enough to become permanent, long enough to become something that was always going to be there, long enough to become something like eternity.